Okay, so our study is called Tools for Virtual Brainstorming and Co-Creation. It's a comparative study of collaborative online learning tools we were using during our two courses at the time of distance learning. So my internet is not great, so if it's okay, I'll switch off my video and just continue. So
Yeah,
collaboration. Yeah.
Dhriti, there are patches on the screen. So if you could close those Zoom windows, then those patches will disappear.
Okay. It's fine now. Yeah. Thanks, Richa. Okay, so collaboration is an intrinsic part of design education, and there are so many studies that have shown that a diversity of skill and composition of design teams is key to coming up with, creative ideas, coming up with creative solutions. So going to the next slide. The impacts of COVID-19 we're all familiar with. There was a huge reduction in face-to-face interactions, which worked okay in some domains, but was a crucial loss in education fields like design, where the teaching learning pedagogy is very, very intimate. And there was an introduction of a lot of didactic methodologies and concepts, which are not the best possible method, but it was what was doable at that time. So design education relies on communication, collaboration, physical participation, and all of this was curtailed heavily and led to lots of impediments. And it is very difficult to replicate the kind of environment that design education needs, where students, especially students who are just starting out at undergraduate level, they need to be surrounded by this environment, which is significantly different from what our school education has led us to. So going to the next slide, just introducing what our studies about. We reflect on collaborative learning, and then we specifically talk about the findings from the tools that we were using, and the tools were also selected based on this experimentation process we did, because for students as well as the teachers, it was a new learning curve that was introduced. So Richa, next slide. So to give you a background to collaborative learning, how it has been defined is that they're educational approaches involving a joint intellectual effort by students and teachers together, who are mutually searching for understanding, solutions, meanings to create a product. So teachers who are using this method, it is not like a teaching learning method, it is considered co-creation. And of course, it harbors a sense of community. There is increased information flow between both parties, cooperation, support, general, greater commitment for shared goals. So also it has to, for it to be called learning, it has to fulfill the basic postulates which the learning hypothesis needs, which is on the next slide, that it has to be active learning, it has to be contextual, there needs to be diversity, it needs to be social. And the goals that the learning hypothesis gives us is that there needs to be student involvement, there needs to be cooperation of all parties concerned for it to be collaborative learning. And yeah, I was still on the previous one. Yeah, just a few slides pehle. Right, yeah, just here. And responsibility needs to be shared. And the tools that we used, we have assessed them on these three goals. So the next slide, yes, thank you. So the approaches to collaborative learning can be many. There need to be joint learning efforts, of course, and the instructor needs to play a supportive role. It's not a leadership role, because, there is no longer this space where a hierarchy can be created or a different power, balance can be made. It is one uniform platform where everyone is coming together. Yeah. And the onus is also shared of the learning to happen. And computer supported collaborative learning, of course, is a huge field of research now post pandemic, and it was already being worked upon pre pandemic. The goals, of course, were making education accessible, but post pandemic it has just become more universal. So the methods that they promote are guided design, case studies, simulations, discussion groups, seminars, and learning communities. The birds chirping actually are part of living in Dehradun. It's very difficult to switch it off. It's coming from my side. I'm very sorry. So collaborative learning and design education has this very basic overlap that both promote problem-based learning, where you start very similar to the kind of conversational learning that Abhishek was just speaking about. Somebody proposes a problem and you jointly come up with a solution. And it helps in understanding complex relationships between systems, subsystems, helps in inculcating decision-making processes in students, which as a designer is crucial. Also, timely feedback loops come into the process very early on. And the one thing which needs to be, I think, worked into collaborative learning, which is happening on digital platforms, is group processing. We have to make time for group processing, for a debriefing, briefing process, and a reflection to help make meaning of this entire experience. Because the cues that we grow up with, you're speaking to a room, you're looking at their faces, you're looking at their body language. There is this entire discussion that's happening which is not verbal, which is not audible at all. And in an online platform, all of that is gone. So a lot of the understanding which we take for granted in face-to-face interactions needs to be specifically worked on, needs to be specifically acknowledged and discussed. Going to the next slide. So the challenges and opportunities within collaborative learning, of course, are time. It requires additional time on the part of the guide, the teacher, as well as the student. Assessment can sometimes be very tricky. It's collaborative. Uh, how do you assign the credit? And, this is an age-old problem of collaboration. Outcomes can be tricky to judge sometimes, unless they have been defined very clearly in the beginning. And the medium, of course, can be the challenge itself. So the literature asks us to focus on areas of group composition. It's very crucial that the group composition has to be, diverse. It should not be a lot of like-minded people working together. The community ethos also makes a difference. There needs to be focus on methods of interaction where our use of tools comes into the picture. Task structuring is important to be thought of, though it's not necessary. It would depend on which method you're using. It could be more open-ended and spontaneous. And methods of meaning making need specific spelling out and reflection. And of course, time management, the age-old dilemma that designers struggle with. Going to the next slide. Richa, please, if you could take over.
Yeah, hi. So the methodology that we used for this study was that we selected two courses, two course modules, and then we made observations and experimentations based on these two courses. So the first one was a 4-week module on interface design. And the second one was design research module. So we chose these courses because one required prototyping and the other required collaborative discussions. So we took these two courses and experimented with like a host of tools and media, and to see what kind of tool is best possible, is the best possible tool which fits this kind of collaborative teaching. So during COVID, the most important dilemma that we were facing was that there was no contact class. So that hands-on teaching with which the students and the faculty, they are used to, that was gone. So this was like a big gap. So we experimented initially with lots of tools, like we used the entire Google suite, which contains Google Meet, Classroom, Jamboard. Then we also experimented with podcasts. Then we used Mural, Miro, Figma. Then there are other things like virtue maps. Then we use mockups. We use MindMeister to see which tool fits the kind of teaching which helps both the student and faculty come to a consensus and eases the entire no contact class thing. So then while using all these tools, we assessed them based on how easily the students were able to use these tools, how good was the interface, and the second thing was what was the outcome that these tools were generating. So if the students were able to produce a lot of data, material, and work based on these tools, then we felt that these tools were successful. So we had to navigate again through a variety of challenges while adapting these tools and digital methodologies. We'll discuss them shortly. So we actually, based on this usage of these tools, we actually selected 3 tools that we felt best represented how not perfectly, but digital like contact classes can be transferred to a digital medium. So as we already know that using a digital medium initially was still in its experimental stage when COVID struck. So it wasn't like it was a method that has been tried and tested. We had to immediately shift to it. So during this, we had to quickly go through all these tools and find which was best fitting teaching methodologies of virtual classrooms. So the first tool that we used was Jamboard. So Jamboard is basically like a smart board provided by Google, and so it worked like a real board. So rather than just sharing, rather than just having a verbal communication with students and sharing slides, we could actually use this tool for theoretical courses, for explaining processes in a live mode. So this improved class engagement because it gave the student a feel of being in the classroom to some extent. So vis-a-vis audio and conference call and a presentation, students were more responsive to using Jamboard in the classroom. Then the second tool, so these are some of the screen grabs that we have. So one good thing about using Jamboard is that in the classes, these boards that we had discussions on could be actually saved and then later referred to by these students. So what happens that in class, whenever we discuss and work on the board, the students take pictures and may or may not refer to them later, but this actually makes it very easy collecting and sorting out these boards. You have timestamp, you have dates and everything. So this engaged the students more. So these are some screen grabs of how we used Jamboard. Then the second tool was a collaborative tool called Miro. So this actually enabled real-time collaboration within among the students. So Miro has some ready templates which can be used for brainstorming, and they can be used for making mind maps. And so this was a tool which was readily adapted by the students. And when we started using Miro, we saw that the number of students significantly improved in the class. Like the students started attending the class more, and the time of class, like if we had an average class of 1 hour, the time significantly increased by like double. So while using Miro and collaborating with each other, the students were present more in class and the class extended for a longer time, because not only were they being instructed, they were also collaborating and building upon each other's ideas. So they were actually able to track each other's work and build upon each other's ideas. So it was an interesting exercise for the students. Then the interface was easy and it hence made the tool interesting. So all the students, they had a very favorable opinion on Miro, and then we subsequently kept on using this tool for further classes also. So these are some screen grabs of usage of Miro. So the students, they were present at the same time, and they were actually able to see through arrows which student is present at what place and what exactly are they typing and writing. So this was something that was liked by students a lot. Then since most of the problems revolved around COVID, so a lot of themes and ideas that came upon while using these tools were related to COVID, and what kind of problem solving, what kind of problems arise, and what kind of problem solving can be done around the topic. So brainstorming actually was a really interesting exercise by using Miro for the students. Then the last tool that we will be discussing here was Figma. So since we had researched on the course of interface design, the students were actually extremely this was an extremely helpful tool which the students use for prototyping and a lot of other things, creating wireframes. So the feedback that we got from students was that it's not that all of these tools were not being used by students, but as a project together in a collaborative environment, these tools were used for the first time. So while at other times the students might or might not end up using these tools, but at the time of COVID, they definitely used these tools, and hence it outlined the importance of how the students were able to organize their work better by using Miro and Figma and Jamboard. So that was visible in the amount and kind of work they were producing and the output that the students were generating. So Figma was another tool that the students used to create wireframes and mockups. They collaborated, and again, they found it easier to use Figma as opposed to the hand sketching of wireframing they were doing earlier. So the amount and the quantity and quality of output increased when we applied Figma into the picture. And while Miro was used more collaboratively and for research and study, Figma provided avenues for organizing the entire toolbox for their design project. So we have some screen grabs of students' work using Figma. So they used it for their research, they used it for their wireframing and for their UI. So it provided a complete set of tools that the students could use from beginning to end, while also sharing their work with their peers for feedback and reviews with the faculty also. So it kind of made the entire feedback process and also the work the students were doing more transparent. So this is another screen grab. So as we already know that the design pedagogy is all about face-to-face interaction, class discussions, and access to labs and a lot of tools that we need to create physical prototypes and produce output, which was a big challenge during the pandemic. So face-to-face class discussions, they had to be replaced with online learning. That was the biggest challenge. And another challenge that we faced was that the approach to learning was extremely experimental. It was in a very initial stage. It had not been tested and vetted, and we quickly shifted from classroom learning to this. So all the assignments, all the projects that the students were doing had to be thought from the perspective of how to fit this in a digital world rather than having physical prototypes and the usage of physical materials. So there were challenges like for any design brief that we needed to share with the students, we had to think of something which they can find inside their own homes and using the tools that are present in their homes, rather than going to the labs and using tools that are present in the product and graphic design labs. So the access to design lab was another challenge that we had to face. So based on these tools usage, we had certain observations. Like the first observation was that general class participation was improved, attendance was improved, students were attending classes more than being present physically. They were more present in the digital classrooms. Then it improved engagement, it improved empathy, and they collaborated more with one another using these digital mediums. And so these tools, they were now being used formally, and they enhanced the experience of these students. They were able to create more outputs, more digital output, but the outputs, the amount of output that they created was more. Then another observation was that in some of the students, there was slight lack of motivation, because being in a class, interacting with your faculty and your seniors and colleagues and friends cannot be replaced by sitting in a room and working. So that slightly brings down the motivation level. And so students had to be constantly motivated into moving ahead with their projects. Then a lot of students belong to the remote areas, and connectivity issue was a big problem. So it was the biggest bottleneck due to these non-contact classes and digital classes. So some of the students actually suffered huge loss of not being able to connect and not being able to have discussions with their peers because of these connectivity issues. So at the end, there's a comparative study that we did for these three tools that we have used. The first portion covers the primary purpose and how can we access these tools and the cost involved in these tools. Then the four other parameters that we have is involvement, how cross-functional these tools are, like for what purpose they can be used in a classroom setting. So like Figma can be used for both brainstorming and designing, while Miro and Jamboard, they can be used only for brainstorming. Then the learnability and the involvement of the students is another parameter. So for Figma, you need to learn the interface. Both for Figma and Miro, you need to first learn and understand the interface. And for Jamboard, you can use it universally. It is relatively easier to use. Then based on cooperation and responsibility, so all of these tools can be used in real time, and they can be used across platform, and they can collaborate live even when they are not sitting together. So that solves a little bit of problem of collaboration within a group when they are doing projects. So I'll be handing over to Dhriti for discussing the conclusions.
Thank you, Richa. So like Richa mentioned in the observations and all the challenges that we faced, we realized that participation in collaborative learning, it demanded a more complex role playing, and the responsibilities not just of the teachers, also the students who were participating. And this online classroom that we were creating every day, it was like an interdependent community, and there were very complex social interactions, including microaggressions and the usual social media problems that we have evolved over the last couple of years. So the one good thing was that how in a class there is this in a physical classroom, I mean, there is this very clear and obvious power relationship which exists, who is the teacher and who is the taught. that in the online platform, like I mentioned earlier, it's not that clear. It's not that the teacher does not get a special desk or a special star around their name as they hover around the board. So that freedom of movement, that democracy of movement changes the way we interact, who's making changes to what part of the board. And another thing which it does is that in a group, who is contributing, who is participating is often not clear, or often it is like you see somebody working at that time and then they disappear, and because the teacher happened to be present, then they feel that is when the work happened, or that's when the ideas were flowing. But in all these digital platforms, in not all of them, Jamboard doesn't have it. In Miro, in Figma, there are digital footprints that you leave. So people can track who's contributed what, when the change was made, and all that changes the power relationships, the spirit of competition, collaboration. Everything is affected when there is this clearly documented history. We observe that during our courses. And of course, the conventional top-down information transmission model of teaching also changed considerably. And the one thing which, like the very public nature of the interactions, you're on a screen in someone's house, in another city altogether. So yes, you are more circumspect about what you say and what feedback you give and who the audience might be. So yes, and going to the next slide, which is our last slide. So the sessions on Miro and Figma especially, they also facilitated reflection. And this thing we keep talking about, and it's an intangible thing. We talk about working to your skills, and in a group, splitting tasks according to where your skills may lie, or the tasks you feel more comfortable with. These particular exercises online on the shared platform, we felt that they also raised the metacognition in all the participants, a more active recognition of things you are good at and things you're not so good at. And the chat history was very interesting, and there were these boundaries. Sometimes there was restraint when the teacher is present, and then the teacher comes back, there's a whole different series of conversations that had been shared, and different parts of the Miro board were used for different things. Like one very anecdotal thing is that we were brainstorming on design education in India and design practice in India, and we were all working on the same board because the two groups needed to be talking to each other. So they were working on different sections of the board, and there was of course a giant gap between them so that elements don't shift. And somebody put this parallel set of bars in between and titled it "The Great Gap Between Design Education and Practice," which we all know exists and is a constant topic of discussion. So it also, yes, brought out a lot of humor and exchange of the interaction that they were missing out due to this remote working situation. So to conclude, we feel that we've gone back to this hybrid way of learning now. There are some things which are continuing online, and most things have switched to physical, but we feel that these digital learning tools that we use, they can still be fantastic tools for collaboration, even now in real-time classes that we're doing. So yeah, we want to finish there. Thank you so much for your time, and please do share any queries and questions.